January 2023. Russia's war against Ukraine has now been going on for 11 months. In this context, some of the sharpest analysis on European security has been coming from think tanks in the Baltic countries. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are members of the EU and NATO, but they share a border with Russia and they have been showing strong solidarity with Ukraine throughout the war. My guest today is Dr. Kristi Raik, Deputy Director and Head of the Foreign Policy Program of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn. Kristi is also a board member of TEPSA and co-author of a recent paper on building European security against Russia. Hello, Kristi.
Hello, and thank you for having me here.
Just recently, on the 10th of January, the EU and NATO published a joint declaration which calls for closer EU-NATO cooperation, but it also recognizes the value of a stronger and more capable European defense, which would be complementary and interoperable with NATO. How do you see the transatlantic relationship? How did European defense look like since the end of the Cold War? And what has changed since February 2022?
Well, I think the war in Ukraine, this stage of the war, has brought more clarity to the EU-NATO relationship and the way they are really complementary to each other. Of course, this rhetoric is not new, what we had in the latest EU-NATO declaration. We have been using the same for many years. And after 2014 already, after the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in Donbass, EU and NATO started to make efforts to cooperate more closely. But now we have come to the point where the need to defend Europe against the Russian threat has really become the #1 priority. It is very clearly stated both in the EU and NATO strategic documents. And it is also now very obvious that NATO has gone back to its traditional historical role of collective defense with Russia as the primary threat. And then the EU has an important role to play in different ways, in complementary ways to NATO. One of them being making a contribution to strengthening European defense capabilities, because this has been something that many European states have not worked on seriously in the past years and decades. Now it seems finally everybody woke up. And I would say NATO is the primary framework for these efforts to strengthen European defense. But the EU can also contribute with its defense cooperation instruments, and there is much more that the EU can do there.
Western military support to Ukraine has been offered in rather small steps. Is this due to a lack of ammunition and equipment of European and American allies? Is this perhaps for strategic reasons or more for the reasons of domestic politics? Why haven't the allies been able to provide Ukraine with more defense against Russian drones and missiles? Is the West making it at all possible for Ukraine to win this war?
As you say, the military aid has been coming step by step. It has been constantly strengthened. And today we are in a very different situation compared to the end of February last year or the first weeks of war, when actually there was quite broad consensus in the West that Ukraine cannot win this war. That Russia is a major power, it is so much more strong militarily that there is no way for Ukraine to survive. Nevertheless, at that time even the Baltic states and other closest supporters of Ukraine were doing everything we could to help Ukraine and to try to persuade other Western countries to do more. And then the attitude started to change when actually Russia was not successful in the first weeks, and Ukraine showed that it is able to defend itself, that it is very committed to defend itself. Unfortunately, the aid has been coming slowly, and this has prolonged the war and increased the amount of death and destruction in Ukraine. But today we are in a very different situation. And of course, it is also a problem that the limits of what Western countries can give in terms of having their own stocks and production limitations, this is also becoming more of an issue. But so far, the limitations have been because of political reasons, because of reluctance of the Western countries to escalate the war, and some kind of hope, I think, that maybe this war can be solved without further increasing Western engagement. But I think now the attitude is that we really need to do the maximum to help Ukraine win the war, and it is seen also as possible outcome that Ukraine can win, but in order to do so, it needs to get a lot of support and more heavy weaponry from the West.
Well, speaking about escalation, I recently heard a high-level EU official saying that France, Germany and Italy were not providing more weapons to Ukraine because of what it would mean in terms of confrontation with Russia. Do you think that this approach is justified? I'm asking also because the Baltics, as the frontline countries, should be the first ones to be worried about possible broadening of the war, but they seem to be more resolute in supporting Ukraine than some of the Western European countries. How do you see that?
Yes, there are differences among European states as to how we see the war and our own interests in this war, and also our future relationship with Russia. In the Baltic states, we have a very strong understanding that we need to defeat Russia in Ukraine, because that is the best way to make sure that the war does not reach our own countries in future. In Western European countries, the perspective is somewhat different. And one issue is that I think some Western European powers have been hoping that if they don't get militarily too much engaged, that they have better opportunities to advance a diplomatic solution to the war, which I think is really misgrounded perception. Russia is putting all the military capability it can in order to achieve its goal to destroy Ukrainian statehood. And before we can get to a diplomatic negotiating table, the realities will be defined on the battlefield, and Russia can be pushed back only by using military force. And Europeans do not improve their ability to be some kind of mediator or peacemaker by limiting their engagement. From the Russian point of view, they actually see the US as the only serious counterpart also for diplomacy, because the US is militarily the strongest counterpart.
Kristi, a recent US poll shows that a majority of Republicans are now in favor of scaling down support for Ukraine. The Washington Post says that this reflects pessimism amongst Republicans about Ukraine's ability to win the war. How significant is this? What would be Europe's reaction if US support was to wane? Would European members of NATO be able to take on their shoulders the main part of financial and military support to Ukraine?
Well, it is clear that the US support is of decisive importance. And without that, Europeans alone would just not be able to offer enough military assistance to Ukraine. At this moment in the near term, I think we can be quite confident that the US support will remain very strong. But we are at a critical moment now. I think this year will be decisive, and it is crucial now to enable Ukraine to proceed on the battlefield, to liberate more of the occupied territories, and to also be prepared to counter any new Russian offensive which is likely to come in the next months. And this military success will then again influence the willingness of Western countries to continue supporting Ukraine. As you say, there are doubts in some countries that if Ukraine cannot win the war, how long are we going to pour money there, and it can go on for many years. So that's why now to give maximum support will also be important for ensuring support to Ukraine in future if there is a prospect of having a positive outcome in the end.
Kristi, in your paper you write, and I quote, that some nations have underinvested in defense while increasing their dependence on Russian energy and maintaining economic relations with Moscow. This led Russia to underestimate the potential Western response both in 2014 and 2022 and undermined NATO's deterrence as well as the security of Ukraine and other allies. Why did this happen? Why was Russia's war against Georgia in 2008 and war against Ukraine in 2014 not sufficient as an alert?
This is a very broad and very important question. There were so many things that went wrong in the European approach to Russia during the post-Cold War era. And I think it all started with very good intentions. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was hope that Russia would democratize and integrate with the Western structures and start sharing the same values and norms. And there was a lot of wishful thinking in the West. So when things started to go in the wrong direction already in the 1990s, many Western countries were not really willing to admit and wanted to hold on to the belief that, well, eventually Russia will democratize and will give up its imperialist ambitions. And when the war between Russia and Georgia happened in 2008, again, many Western countries wanted to somehow isolate this issue and hope that nonetheless it is possible to develop a positive relationship with Russia. There was belief in positive interdependence, the idea that by having economic exchange, it is possible to advance stability and security. And then also I must say that the Western positions on Russian sphere of influence were quite contradictory and ambiguous. That, of course, in the European security order, spheres of influence are not accepted. This is the principle inscribed in the OSCE documents. And nonetheless, I think de facto, the Western countries did acknowledge that Russia has a privileged role in the post-Soviet space. And the Western countries themselves were not ready to treat all the post-Soviet countries as fully sovereign. They were not clearly kind of denying Russia the right to keep this privileged influence in the post-Soviet region, although the countries such as Ukraine and Georgia and others were making efforts to reduce their dependence on Russia and wanted to actually orientate towards Europe.
When you said that some EU nations indirectly acknowledged Russia's right to a privileged role in the post-Soviet space, were you referring to the 2008 Bucharest summit here? Do you think that after the war, countries that have been so far opposed to Ukraine's NATO membership will be more open to it?
That is one issue where we still don't have consensus among NATO countries. And indeed, the decision in NATO in 2008 was very unhelpful. It sent the signal to Russia that NATO is not really interested in seeing Ukraine and Georgia as future members of the alliance. So it kind of gave the green light to Russia that encouraged Russia to move ahead with its vision to reimpose its sphere of influence over these countries. And the assessment in Russia was that the West would then not do anything serious to counter the Russian policy. Whether we are in a different situation now, I think as long as the war continues, the issue of Ukraine's potential NATO membership is something that the alliance wants to avoid raising too much, because it has been so important for NATO to make sure that the war does not turn into a NATO-Russia war. But once the war stops, and we will have to face this question of what kind of security guarantees Ukraine will be offered, then the most straightforward, the easiest response is to admit Ukraine as a NATO member and include it in the NATO deterrence policy. That would be the best way to make sure that Russia will not attack again, because NATO deterrence so far has worked very successfully.
Kristi, the 2014 war in eastern Ukraine was partly de-escalated after the so-called Minsk agreements. Your paper mentions that these agreements were interpreted in contradictory ways, and Russia tried to turn them into a tool to break Ukraine's sovereignty. Can you elaborate what was wrong with the Minsk agreements and with their implementation?
Well, maybe to start from a more positive aspect. Of course, in 2014, the Ukrainian defense capability was not in the shape where it is today. And what the Minsk agreements did, they helped to stabilize the situation on the front line and allowed Ukraine to have time to build up its defense capability. But then the way France and Germany were approaching the Minsk agreements, they were kind of not clearly seeing that Russia was not involved in good faith, that Russia did not really start implementing the agreements, and the Russian aim was to use the Minsk agreements in order to kind of solidify the Russian presence in the Donbas region, and then to turn Donbas into the main instrument for Russian influence over Ukraine by getting a veto power to the regions in Donbas, and having Russian control over the regions. It would have led to a de facto Russian veto power over Ukraine's decisions. And indeed, there were different interpretations of the Minsk agreements. And what was very unfortunate was that Ukraine was under pressure from European countries to try to make some concessions in order to move ahead with the implementation, although it did not look like the Minsk agreements could lead to a viable solution to the conflict.
Kristi, you underline that Ukraine's integration into the EU is important also from the security point of view. What do you see as a realistic timeline for opening accession negotiations with Ukraine?
I think it is very important to keep this EU enlargement process as a credible one, and to keep it as a dynamic process. Because the Ukrainians are very seriously making every effort to move ahead, and the next step indeed is the launch of the accession negotiations. So in order to keep Ukraine motivated to continue with the European path and with the reforms that are needed, there has to be a constant movement ahead and a very clear commitment from the EU side. And that's where I'm a little bit concerned that some countries, member states in the EU, tend to think that it is going to be a decades-long process anyway, so let's not hurry with moving forward today. I agree that it will be a long process, and Ukraine has to meet the conditions, membership criteria. There should be no concessions there. But it is in the EU's interest to do everything it can to support Ukraine on this path and to keep moving on and develop a kind of step-by-step approach. Because that is the way to make sure that Ukraine develops as a democratic country and stays with its European orientation, and that's also then the way to have lasting security in Europe by integrating Ukraine to the European Union.
Would you say that Ukraine's post-war reconstruction should be done within this enlargement framework?
Definitely, yes. The reconstruction effort, of course, will be massive, and it is in the interest of Ukraine, it is in the interest of the EU to very clearly connect the reconstruction efforts to the implementation of EU membership criteria.
Thank you, Kristi. Considering Russia's imperial aspirations, which have been so clearly revealed during the ongoing war, do you see a prospect of restoring normal relations with Russia in the horizon of 5 to 10 years? Can we speak of a significant group of Russian liberals who see Russia as a state rather than an empire?
Well, Russia has been an empire for centuries. And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it did not actually abandon its imperialistic attitude to neighboring countries. Whether it will happen in future, I don't want to completely exclude the possibility. I want to be hopeful that Russia's defeat in Ukraine might actually launch a deep rethinking in Russia. It is not very rational in today's world for a country to try to hold on to an empire and impose neighboring countries to be part of its sphere of influence. It is not serving Russia well. But whether this change will happen anytime soon, I am not optimistic. I think the EU and NATO need to plan their Russia policy based on the assumption that for many years to come, Russia will remain authoritarian, and it will also continue to hold on to its imperialistic view on neighboring countries, which means also that as long as this is the case, we cannot go back to some kind of normal relations. The relationship will be confrontational. And what is the position of the democratic Russian opposition? Well, unfortunately, the opposition forces are small and very fragmented. They are not in a position to become the next leaders of Russia when the time of Putin is over one day. I think it's much more likely that the next leader will come from the same circle and will represent a similar worldview as we see now Russia so brutally following in Ukraine.
My last question would be, what change do you hope to see in the foreign and security policies of the EU and of its member states as a lesson from the war in Ukraine?
There are huge changes underway already. So it is important to then be consistent in implementing them. One is for the EU to really take a role in stabilizing Central and Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, Moldova and beyond, to be committed in the region and to very clearly deny Russia the right to impose its sphere of influence on any country. Then another important point is how we see economic interdependency. It is a huge paradigm shift that is happening. In the post-Cold War era, there was this belief in the West that by expanding trade and economic globalization, you can also promote liberal values and make the world safer. This has not worked that way, and we have learned not only with the war in Ukraine, but also during COVID, that economic dependence on major authoritarian powers is actually undermining our own security. So we need to rethink the way we see economic relations with authoritarian powers. And then a final point is that in order for Europe to really be a credible security actor in future, it must strengthen its hard power capabilities. And this is something that European countries were not taking seriously for many years. They did not expect a major war to return to the European continent. Unfortunately, now it has returned, and we have to draw the consequences from that.
Well, thank you very much, Kristi. I can only recommend your paper to our viewers. And thank you all for watching. We'll be back with further episodes of EuropeChats soon.